minutes and that's okay, yeah? Can check?
Yeah, check.
You heard? Yeah. Okay.
Good check. Okay, that makes it easier. Thank you. Yes. Okay. All right. We're up and running.
Yeah, that's fine.
All good? Yes. Oh, okay. Sure. This is like for TV.
We're properly Columbia time.
Yeah.
Now, there was a final paper.
1 minute and let's start.
Okay.
More than 100 countries. It is crucial that we use the necessary safety ratification as soon as possible to bring the treaty into force.
I feel like it's an airport. We've delayed the first flight. The whole day is going to be rolling delays.
Hopefully not.
Do you have the clicker? Okay, I'm on the signal. Let's start.
Yep. Let's start.
3, 2, 1, start.
Okay, all right. Thank you everyone for joining us. We have a packed room here at the Nature Positive Pavilion, in the small room, with a audience of millions tuning in via the internet. My name is Kobad Bhavnagri. I'm the head of strategy for Bloomberg NEF, and I'm joined by two of our expert analysts on the topic of nature and biodiversity. We have Hugh Bromley, who is the head of food, agriculture and nature, leads our analysis team located in Sydney, and we have Alistair Purdy, who is a senior analyst in nature and biodiversity, located in London. So, Hugh, Alistair, you've just presented some research over the last few days of publications that we've launched over the course of this conference. Do you want to just take us through some of the highlights? And we want to discuss here, how do we make the money flow? How do we begin to close the financing gap? So, who wants to kick off there?
Maybe I'll start just with some context on where we are in financing, in that financing gap. Earlier in the week, we released an updated finance fact book. Really, here what we're doing is tracking the financial flows through the economy. We've tracked about $208 billion of annual flows. So that's an achievement. That's up from around just over 160 billion last time we checked in on this, which was 18 months ago, roughly. And up from about 130 billion when the Global Biodiversity Framework was reached. So there is progress there. The problem is that progress is only just keeping pace with inflation, in fact, or exceeding inflation. So when we think about what's needed by 2030, we've got a need to prevent biodiversity collapse of around $1.15 trillion by 2030 in 2023 dollars. So that's really that's the problem, is that the financing gap is in fact moving further ahead because of inflationary effects, and the gap is actually widening. So the gap has widened to roughly $942 billion as of this last assessment.
Yep. So that's where we are. That's the current state of play. So the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, has set the overarching goal. What we're really failing to see, at least so far in the negotiations and in the intervening period, has been this being backed in by policy, right? By the ambition of the framework, which is fairly well correlated with the science of what we need. We know is needed in order to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Has been fairly well informed. The ambition has been set, but the frameworks to get there have not. The only major jurisdiction to really try and achieve some progress on that has been the European Union and some EU member states over the last 2 years, and we've seen them struggle to be able to work policy that could start to address some of the goals: fertilizer reductions, pesticide use reductions, emissions reductions in the food system, we've seen them really struggle to work those through the parliament. So the gauntlet really rests with the finance sector. Alistair, what's the hypothesis? How can we begin to make money flow? But what are the ingredients? What is needed?
Well, yeah, totally agree about the need to scale up private finance. The business case for doing that is quite challenging. So obviously in the financial sector, there's been a lot of talk of exotic financial instruments, debt for nature swaps, biodiversity credits, similar things. But right now it's too early to make a strong investment case based on returns. So firstly, we have to look at where we can make the biggest impact and generate returns doing so. That will minimize both transition risk and also in creating some of these projects and business models, you can also create some kind of abatement of damage. So obviously UNEP identified 5 trillion in financial flows that was directly harmful for nature. The key investment thesis here is find out what is driving or where that 5 trillion is going, repurpose it, reframe it into new technologies, do existing practices better, and shift business models. So we profiled 10 instances of companies who are doing just that, across a range of different drivers, across a range of different company types, and generating a wide range of different financial returns. Should we go through one of them or look more at the direct drivers first, I guess?
Sure. Why don't you give us an example of it,
Sure.
of a company?
Yeah. So the background for this is there's 5, well, according to IPBES, there's 5 direct drivers of nature loss, which together account for about 92% of the total decline in biodiversity and ecosystem services. The most prevalent among them is land use change. Secondary is natural resource exploitation, obviously climate change, then pollution excluding greenhouse gases, and invasive alien species. These are the 12 companies we took a look at. They span many sectors and industries. They're drawn from 7 different countries. 5 are located in the US, but the remaining 7 across 1 each from different geographies. They differ in the kind of nature impact that they address, so impact mitigation rather than conservation or uplift. And there are a range of different companies. Some are startups, some are large public equities, and as I said before, different kinds of financial gain realized. So we'll take a look at one and see what's happening. What do you reckon is the best one? Let's do Perfect Day. It's a pretty good one. So yeah, if we take a look at the dairy industry, it drives a lot of damage in nature. And as we see, we've provided some statistics on the extent of that damage. So about 7% of all habitable land on Earth is occupied by dairy, either by the animals themselves, or more saliently, the land required for growing crops to feed those livestock. It's responsible for a huge amount of freshwater extraction, and accounts for around 5% of global emissions. You could argue it's more, but the best we can do is verify 4.7%. Just 1 litre of milk requires about 600 litres of water, 9 metres squared of land, and emits 3 kilograms of CO2e. So it's a huge amount for just 1 litre. We found this company, Perfect Day, which is based in California, and it's developed a fascinating solution based on precision fermentation. It removes the needs for animals in the production of dairy. So you take a genetically modified fungal strain, you place it in a bioreactor, set the temperature and pressure to an extent that it's stimulated to produce a whey protein that's molecularly identical to beta-lactoglobulose, I believe it's called, in cow's milk. The product is then dried, filtered, and sold to other CPG food-producing companies as an ingredient for dairy products. The company's doing really well to date, and of course the impact of that. By doing that and removing the need for the livestock in the production of dairy, you reduce your water requirements by 99% relative to conventional milk. It's got 96% lower greenhouse gas emissions, and it accounts for a much smaller land share depending on the volume of milk you're able to produce. And it's doing really well as a startup. It's raised over 800 million. It's valued at over 1.5 billion. And it's selling its products all across retail stores in North America. It's secured long-term offtake agreements with big retailers like Target, Walmart, and others. And Unilever sells the product in many of its ice creams, just as an ingredient. Many consumers are not aware they're buying animal-free dairy, but as a testament to the quality of the ingredient and the molecular how identical it is to the original, lactose intolerant people can't consume it, despite the fact that there are no animals involved in its production. So we got a bit more information on what the company does. This is the production process. You can see the bioreactor, the inputs and the feedstock, and then how the final product, the whey protein, is removed and filtered and used in a range of dairy products. The left-hand chart shows the impacts relative not only to conventional dairy milk, but also to alternative milks, which are touted as extremely environmentally friendly, but it shows that we can do better in terms of water and emissions impact. So that's one. We profiled 12 such companies addressing a range of different issues that have all generated tangible financial return.
In biodiversity finance, we tend to talk about either the public mechanisms or the blended mechanisms or quite novel financial or environmental products, right? You look at the chart I showed earlier of that $208 billion, roughly 80% is government, the 20% that's private sector is largely led by carbon offsets, biodiversity offsets, and supply chain intervention. So actually lots of novel products that we tend to focus on here. And the point of this exercise, I think, is to take a step back and say, let's not get too preoccupied with the financial engineering of solutions. Let's think about how we can really drive major reductions in damage in the real economy. And do you want to kind of talk to that, how we think about different ways of mitigating harm through businesses and how that creates an investment opportunity?
Well, yeah, exactly. It's so much is made about the need for financial instruments that are catered towards conservation and restoration and uplift, but there's very little business case for that right now. That's not to say that these financial instruments are not valuable, they don't serve a purpose. If we really want to address the current rate of nature loss, it needs to be in the tangible, real economy with an investable return. So the thesis is identify those 5 drives of nature loss, what products, what industries, what sectors are contributing to those direct drivers, like which product, which soft commodity is most responsible for land and sea use change, what's driving damage through natural resource exploitation. All of these also contribute to climate change, which is in itself a driver of nature loss. So you find these products, many of which are extant, and refine them. Find resource efficiency gains, find novel ways of engineering the same product and derive a financial return. And in doing so, you're able to mitigate your own transition risk and carve into a market where there's pretty much this ripe for intervention, essentially.
Yeah, let's bring the audience in here. We've got a massive audience over here in the Nature Positive Pavilion.
Huge.
Can we? Any questions from the floor? Yes, over here. Should we pass the microphone just in case you can't be heard in the back of the auditorium?
It's a rowdy audience too, isn't it?
In a way, I mean, it's a perfect story, but it's also in a way business as usual.
Mm-hmm.
Or you don't need kind of the biocredits that everyone is trying to fumble around with now, and you see a lot of pilots, but they never scale up.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the how can you make this happen? I mean, if it's business as usual, or what do I miss?
I have 2 points on that. I think, firstly, these businesses do exist, these opportunities exist, but I think what we've separated here is incremental gain. Like there is supply chain interventions happening that are 3%, 5% reductions in harm that are business as usual. What we're talking about here are interventions that are 99% reduction in water use. Others are a 97% reduction in chemical application. That's not quite business as usual. That needs a bit of uplift. The second thing is who is the investor audience for these companies? And actually they're being approached by venture capital pursuing ag tech, food tech, in some cases climate or impact, but actually they're not considered a nature class of assets right now. So the point we're trying to highlight here is that there is this class of there's this suite of technologies, suite of interventions available that we have never thought of as nature interventions before, but are actually really impactful, probably more impactful than nature positive instruments that we do talk about in this forum. It's awareness, yeah. It's to say that if you look inside the biodiversity funds, you generally you see some of these technologies in there. You know, you see, example, a company like John Deere that has been probably the biggest investor in agricultural spray technology is in, I think, 3 or 4 of the biodiversity listed funds. So they are seeing this as that play as well, right? It's not just about the financial engineering.
Yeah, so some of it is new and some of it requires investment to spur and grow the technology. Like this requires additional capital to scale. But a lot of it is existing interventions through resource efficiency, which while smaller are nonetheless important. We've heard throughout the entire last week of biodiversity funds and investors looking for where their money should go. And because they can't identify a concrete, reasonable solution set, they land on things like biodiversity credits. And then the hype cycle just begins. Whereas we actually have tangible investments into the real economy that can contribute significantly to mitigating loss. So we want to highlight that.
In the report, we draw the parallel back to clean energy, right? And for a couple of reasons. One, the investment in climate and transition has really been focused on mitigation. Negligible investment in carbon removals. And actually the conversation right now in nature is the equivalent of removals as nature positive activity. We've forgotten about that first step of reducing harm or getting harm to zero. So that's really the analogy. The second thing is what made that scale in clean energy is that there was concentration around technologies, recognition that these technologies can be driven at scale, and many of the things we're talking about here could be. They're not being yet, but they could be. The missing piece is one, investment awareness, investment comfort with the technology, and also policy. Right? Let's not forget that clean energy for this first 10, 15 years are really driven by policies that we have nothing similar to in any of the technologies of harm that we're looking at here.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point, right? If actually the biggest, the way you could think about business as usual really is if the onus is only on government or some third party to fund restoration, and you just continue driving nature loss through, and the economy as a whole just continues chugging along driving nature loss, that's like carbon offsets but no mitigation. So this realistically is where the money needs to be flow. If we go back to that investment chart, that actually talks about the sectors where the capital needs to go, and the majority of it is in the real economy, right? It's in agriculture, it's in croplands and rangelands, because agriculture is driving 80% of biodiversity loss. We have to find ways to make agriculture much less impactful. Otherwise, all we're doing is fiddling at the edges, really. Cool.
So just to keep with that perfect day example, the point here is we're trying to mobilize private capital, right? So I would say almost that soulless capital should be able to deploy. It's just about the return, right? But in the perfect day example, is that company able to make money? We know about the impact, but maybe making money, maybe making that whey protein through fermentation, if it's much more expensive than milk, how does it make money? Does it compete with regular milk?
So Perfect Day became margin positive in 2020. It scaled sufficiently so its unit costs went under the whey, by volume, the amount of whey protein required to make a liter of milk became cheaper than conventional dairy. So that's why the big CPGs are buying it and using it in their products. Same as you say, soulless capital. Same we have the soulless CPG, like the retailers and the manufacturers themselves. They don't really care if it's animal or not, if it's molecularly identical, and they can make an economic case for it. So that's why it's compelling. Some of the other cases we've highlighted are bordering on profitability. Others have been profitable for decades. This one is in the middle. It's about 4 years profitability, hundreds of millions in revenue, and set to scale with credible VC and other backing. So there is an investment case. This isn't, for us, we're entirely objective here. We're taking this through the lens of that soulless VC grouping. So we can't come at this as like an environmentalist here. We're looking at it from the financial sector, and these companies do have tangible returns.
But it is early days. They're at small scale, and you imagine as that technology scales, precision fermentation should have a fundamentally lower cost base than farming without land. 99% reduction in water. Water has a cost, so you need scale to drive that cost down. You skip the metabolic cycle and remove the need for feed, remove the need for water, decent power requirement. But there's lots of fundamentals there that suggest, just like clean energy, just like batteries, perhaps not quite a steep a learning curve, but there is some economies of scale to be achieved.
The general point is, of course, correct in that in order for this thesis to work, we need to have businesses that are economically competitive, that are producing goods and services that are at the same cost of the environmentally damaging incumbent or less. And that requires usually, it requires investment, it requires technology, it requires coming down a learning curve. And so, I think we cannot pretend that this is going to happen in the absence of policy, or in the absence of some level of green premium from a consumer or from a company that is willing to pay over the odds to try and scale this up, essentially because they're motivated by an ethical imperative. So, it does point again to the fact that we're acting in a policy vacuum here. The settings aren't sufficient to be able to mobilize the amount of capital that is required, but this is kind of the playbook for how, is that we need to find technologies with a route to economic competitiveness. We need government to be able to back that in to achieve the fastest pathway to scale of less environmentally damaging goods and services. But in the absence of that, there are some green shoots at least.
The smart money moves slightly faster than the rest of the sort of wall of money that follows. We've seen that in climate.
Yeah.
So if you take a view that nature is getting rarer and scarcer, the policy isn't there as yet. But can you make a bet that the policy, it's pretty likely that policy will come in at some stage. So positioning yourself, in the perfect day example, somebody that doesn't need huge land and water footprint to make your product, could that pass an investment committee that really is not green in any way, but just looking at the investment case?
Maybe, but it's a very small class of investors that is willing to take that long a view, right? Most investors need to achieve a return in a couple of years, or at least you need to have a good visibility of return. It's the rare investor that can take that long-term a position and that degree of risk, both on when the bet will pay off, both on if the bet will pay off and when. So I think we are, you're playing with very thin edges of the market then.
But it's also true that a lot of the companies profiled among the startups at least, they're in their later rounds of funding. They've demonstrated profitability and they have a strong business case. It's essentially been de-risked as far as we're concerned. It's not seed funding that we're talking about. It's demonstrably workable business models with saleable products that are retailing now. This is here. It's just how are they categorized and thought of, in addition to changing regulation aligned with the GBF.
And also, when I think about where the smart money can go in early, I would separate investment around the symptoms of nature loss and investment in the solutions to nature loss. And here we've largely looked at solutions, and I can see that some of these will be perceived as risky or not ready for that money to move into. But I think what we are seeing is there's money flowing into mitigation of symptoms. And what I mean by that is you look at in the agri-food value chain, there is money moving with a longer term horizon to mitigate exposure to water scarcity or mitigate exposure to land productivity, the consequence of climate change or ecosystem collapse. I think there's already some momentum there from some of the smart money. I think that is a bit more tangible because in the absence of policy, that becomes very real. In this suite of solutions, we're saying that this is a whole lot more tangible and real than some other instruments that are out there.
And it does find an intersection between risk mitigation and opportunity here. So you have to ask yourself, why are the big food companies setting moderately ambitious targets on nature, on water, on emissions, on land use? They're moving into regenerative agriculture. Why? Because there's a business case for it, while also mitigating their exposure to risk, transition risk specifically.
Well, there is absolutely the cynical view, which is they're doing it to just maintain as much social license as possible, but it's essentially a marketing and a branding exercise.
So there was a point made about the consumer willingness to pay a green premium. And we found, or studies have generally shown, that consumers say they'll be happy to pay a 10%-ish premium on more nature-friendly products, but that doesn't come through when you look at actual transaction data. So I don't think there is a case for consumers bearing higher price. It just has to be the raw investment case, something done equally well and same price or cheaper.
I just say that in the energy transition, somebody made the point that the subsidies that brought renewables in, like nobody really knew how much money. The consumer, the politics of subsidy in renewables was by accident or intention done cleverly so that nobody really knew how much money was subsidizing renewables. I mean, I don't know if you have a view on. I mean, should that be the case for nature, that it should be kind of hidden from view?
Yeah, but you have to think about the timing. That renewables incentive was very Keynesian. It was coming off the back of the GFC largely, or so it was a financial recovery instrument as the IRA has been positioned in the US, albeit not as acute a need. We haven't had that economic stress that policymakers have responded to and said, let's use nature as the vehicle to deliver incentive. So I think that just hasn't come about and isn't on the horizon right now.
Yeah. Like, what would government intervene? Do governments need to set up offtake agreements with companies to ensure that early products are more financially secure? Is that their role, or is it just pure sticks?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think we need to consider more. I mean, one of the complexities with nature and biodiversity is that the solution set is quite diffuse. There are lots of problems to solve. There are lots of sectors that play a role. There's certainly a role for regulation in some of them of just minimizing harm, not discharging waste. And in some cases, it's to help the consumer to or the product manufacturer to bring a new good to market and to scale it. But I guess it's worth underscoring the importance of the opportunities narrative, though. Both you and I come from Australia, and in Australia, the lived experience of climate policy is really, really instructive here. For a decade and a half, there was a narrative about climate being a risk to the Australian economy and to the Australian way of life. From everything from the science of damages to the fact that the economy and companies would eventually, at some undefined point in the future, be hit by the fact that there would be a market transition away from fossil fuels. And that narrative never was enough to catalyze action. It did not. It wasn't able to gain enough support through the political process, and it did not capture the imagination of the business community, and nor did it achieve buy-in of the citizenry at large. When the narrative flipped to the energy transition being a great opportunity for Australia to become a renewable energy superpower, then we saw an alignment of interests. We saw the business community back in that idea. We saw the community at large become inspired, and then we saw that manifest in the ballot box in the election of and a significant groundswell of political change, which has now seems to have underpinned a political consensus that Australia can profit from the energy transition. That there is investment to be made, that there is money to be had, and that now Australia can lean in. And we've seen that dynamic play out in many countries, in many industries, in many different types of constituencies. So mobilizing investment, focusing on opportunities is just a really critical framing in order to be able to get people to solve problems. So this is really important. But the need for government policy to be able to facilitate that and to make it happen is also important to stress. And government can do that through a variety of carrots and sticks. But if it does not act, then this will move very slowly. if government is able to put in place those carrots and sticks, then we have a better chance of seeing things scale at a quicker rate.
So, for instance, in the EU, we're seeing regulation that could actually. Sorry, what's going on in there? Was that like the greatest speech of all time or something?
That was a big. You can wear your headsets actually. That will help. And can we actually get one more microphone here? So one for the floor and one extra for the panel. Sorry, Alistair, continue.
Yeah, so we were seeing like early green shoots of promising regulation in the EU. We had the nature restoration law, we had the EUDR, both of which have either been watered down or delayed, and that makes it like similar to what Kobad was saying with the Australian instance. If it's framed purely through risk, then there's less incentive to channel finance into it. It is about shifting it towards the opportunity and mitigating nature loss. Yeah. On the policy side, it's quite difficult until it becomes slightly clear about what the winning technologies or practices will be. I think it's unlikely we'll see strong government intervention to support them.
To potentially to back in a winner. I mean, or to back in a technology. For instance, like solar, PV got a lot of the early policy support because it was a politically useful subsidy. It helps with energy costs, and people can put it on their roofs. Once they do that, they're happy, and you're helping. There is an alignment of incentives for the policymaker.
But is it not the same, you could argue, in agriculture? Isn't there incentive? Like everyone wins except farmers who contribute 3% of GDP?
Well, I mean, the key in why policy reform in this space has been so difficult is because although in developed economies, farmers are a very small proportion of the overall demographic, they're always a very powerful constituency, and they tend to be an important swing constituency in the political process. So actually, I agree with that point, that financial incentives to help farmers to use, for instance, precision agricultural spot spraying, which can dramatically reduce the impacts of fertilizers, can be a win-win for the environment, for politicians, and for scale-up and deployment of these technologies.
So there's an opportunity there.
Yes.
for political capital and for the companies involved at providing that precision application technology. But instead we saw the EU say, let's cut pesticide and fertilizer application rates and then walk it back. Instead of that, why didn't they just subsidize this technology and then achieve the same results?
Yeah, I mean that is a great question, and perhaps the way that the pendulum will shift. And the typical difference actually between the European approach and the American approach. The American approach is always to subsidize, to offer tax incentives. The European approach tends to try to mirror classical economic theory by putting in the sticks, which has had less political buy-in often. So we're in the energy transition. We're at an interesting point where we're seeing which one wins, but a little bit of both doesn't help. Doesn't harm. Any more questions from the floor? We have a microphone floating around.
What do you see as the major barriers to uptake?
Uptake of?
Of things like perfect day, etc. What are the major barriers to them taking off and becoming bigger players in the industry?
I'll just repeat the question for the audience tuning in online. That was what are the major barriers to uptake of things like Perfect Day, or by extension any of these solutions here, which it's hard to know exactly of the profitability of these companies. A lot of them are early stage; they're not yet declaring financial statements, but they do seem to have an economic proposition. So, what are the barriers here? What's stopping them scaling?
In the instance of Perfect Day, it's unfamiliarity, both from consumers and in the supply chain. So generally you have long-term partnerships. Like if you're a CPG, you'll have an agreement with a farmer who will provide you milk, which you use as an ingredient. You have to break that and go with a potentially risky new technology or way of providing the dairy. Why take that risk unless it's backed, unless it's secured by either policy or someone in the financial system? So my answer would be risk, unfamiliarity, and right now potentially lack of capital lack of funding to support these technologies, even though they're there.
Yeah, consumer cost is going to be a barrier right now. When I think about this, and that example is an alternative protein, really what we're seeing, I separate Perfect Day from the last wave of alternative proteins, or plant-based proteins that were by design came at a consumer cost premium, appealing to a fairly niche audience, and didn't perform as they're expected to. I think what's a little bit different here is that it's nutritionally identical to animal dairy proteins. And for that reason, it can actually be included in typical dairy products in a covert way. You know, it's an ingredient supplier. It's an ingredient made into cultured dairy or cheeses or whatever it might be, rather than being a labeled product where it's clear that it's from an alternative source. I think that's promising. And then it comes down to the cost. Is there a cost premium here? That could be addressed through scale. That will require more finance into the institutions, as you kind of suggested. But I think there is some promise here. We need scale. We need the price point. We had this barrier around consumer awareness and acceptance. I think we can mitigate that in many cases through the next generation, but it's something to be conscious of.
And we'd also like to emphasize that for many of these companies, there hasn't been a barrier. They've scaled extremely rapidly, and several of them are already incumbents, providing, largely resource efficiency technologies and interventions that have been around for decades.
Any other questions?
I would like to respond a tiny bit more. So there is a bond lens to this as well. So we presented this yesterday, and we had a sustainable finance person from JP Morgan on the panel who talked about the relationship between this and green bond issuance, like how you could tie this to Article 9 finance and such. It's a legitimate case, and investors in the EU are looking desperately for those dark green investments. Here's a suite of them into an emerging theme that mitigates nature loss.
Yeah. But so, Alistair and Hugh, if I can ask you, we have a range of technologies here, operating in a range of sectors, solving a range of different problems, from battery recycling to alternative dairy, as we talked about, forestry, precision agriculture, harvesting invasive species. What sector do you think has the most potential today to scale? Where do you think billions of dollars of capital can be mobilized? Where is the best promise?
So you asked me this yesterday, and I answered on the spot without thinking, and I just was drawn instantly to the area with the biggest impact, which is agri-food. But I think political barriers there are too steep right now to garner immediate impact and reduction and returns that we'd like to see. I think it's going to be in something quite prosaic, maybe like redwood materials. It's garnered so much funds, it's got the support of the US government. It's doing something massively unattractive, which is just taking battery scrap, recycling it back into lithium-ion batteries that goes into EVs, and it reduces the harm of the EV industry, which is one of the lightning rods for criticism it gets, the impact of its batteries and critical minerals. I think it's great, and you have to essentially be an expert to understand what it's doing. But it's just there, and it's solving an important issue by reducing a significant amount of impact while achieving cost savings.
I agree with that. I think in terms of what's ready to go right now, could make a big impact in the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years. I think alternative materials, largely through recycled feedstock, is ready to go. There's some really good examples of already commercialized products. We're not talking about startups, we're talking about scale-ups and bigger. So that's one, whether it be in batteries or whether it be in building materials. We have another example in there. The other one I think that's ready to go is resource efficiency, and in particular around water. We have a couple of case studies around that, because you can get dramatic reductions in either water consumption, cost saving, or water pollution as an output and risk mitigation. That again, technology that in many cases is decades old, just needs to be scaled through industries. I think agriculture is where the impact is and where the action is required. I think it'll be a bit of a slower burn, but even there we see some examples. We've actually alluded to it a few times here, but we looked at a company, AGCO, like one of the top 3 agricultural machinery companies in the world, that acquired the agricultural unit of Trimble, which is a Silicon Valley startup, data play, that provides precision technology that, using AI, identifies weeds in fields and sprays herbicide just on those weeds rather than on the entire field. So in that instance, you get a 97% reduction in the amount of chemical applied to the field, a massive reduction. it costs a lot. It costs 2 to 3 times as much for the equipment as what a dumb broadcast sprayer will cost you. So very high upfront capex, very low operating costs because you just save 97% of your chemical costs. But that's a barrier to farmers. Farmers can't afford necessarily that upfront cost. We need to start thinking about financing mechanisms that allow them to have a higher capex structure than they historically have. Because when we do the analysis and run some models levelizing that cost, thinking about high capex, low opex, what does that mean to your total cost of ownership, we arrive at numbers like a 60% reduction in the farmer's cost of operating that machinery, owning and operating that machinery over its lifetime. So a massive reduction if you can overcome the capex barrier. And that's a financing challenge. That's what we're here to talk about. It's a financing challenge. And that's the same as electric vehicle. High upfront cost, lower operating costs. The same as a solar plant or a wind plant. Originally, higher capex, not anymore. Low opex. We have this same challenge now. We just need to be a bit more creative in how we finance these technologies.
All right, so some reason for optimism in some sectors, but much more to be done here. So thank you very much for joining us, Alistair, Hugh. A QR code to the free publication of our research is there for the audience and for the people joining in online. So with that, wish everyone a very successful COP16. Thank you.
everyone hear me? Okay. Very good. Okay. Apologies for this. The last session was running late, and so we are trying to make up time here. But thank you so much for joining us and coming today. It's going to be slightly a little bit chaotic with the noise outside, and so I think you're just going to have to bear with us. When we try to go through this. If you were in the session is to make sure we're all in the right place. Is building towards policy coherence and how can biodiversity regulation be shared goal amongst stakeholders. So hopefully with that title we'll get to understand what that means and be able to unpack that a little bit. But having said that, I think it'd be helpful just to offer a few opening remarks that I scribbled down at 5:30 this morning. So that will be useful to sort of framing of the discussion. I think I don't need to tell this crowd that there is an enormous amount of environmental challenges, and I guarantee that in every session that you attended, you will have heard that around the funding, and the funding has come up time and time again. And this is around the protecting, restoring, managing of natural resources in a very sustainable way. We've heard about the 8% of global GDP allocated to harmful fisheries, to harmful subsidies, and how do we redirect that when that comes to Target 18, and that's something I know, Patricia, you've been championing here and talking a lot about. But it's obviously something that we need to discuss. And of course, a small portion of this would be transformational, absolutely transformational, and towards a nature-positive economy. And really adapting communities, particularly those most vulnerable, those that are disproportionately affected, to be able to adapt when it comes to biodiversity loss, but also protect and restore that biodiversity loss. Can you hear okay? Yeah, okay. Oh, I see, okay. Okay, better reception, okay. But of course we've got the GBF, and hopefully everyone knows that acronym. Global Biodiversity Framework. We're all here. It's important though. It's an important one to remind ourselves that just not starting where everyone is as opposed to where we want them to be. And we've got other multilateral policies that require commitment, funding, innovation, and well coordinated. And I think part of this is also this coordination and coherence amongst the policies, whether it's in climate, whether it's in food, whether it's in biodiversity. And I know a lot of people here are really starting to think more and more about that as a pathway forward. So this session is really thinking about ways to strengthen